Tonight, how did it come to this? The fragility of our national energy system is being exposed, delivering an early test for the government. So how can it be fixed? And what's ahead as we transition to a cleaner future? Welcome to Q&A. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight. And joining me on the panel, inventor, author and scientist Saul Griffith, who wants to electrify Australia. Chief Executive of the Australian Energy Council, Sarah McNamara. In Sydney, because he's had a bit going on this week, Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Chris Bowen. The independent member for Goldstein, Zoe Daniel. And Energy and Climate Change Program Director at the Grattan Institute, Tony Wood. Please make them all feel very welcome. Now remember, you can stream us on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag, so please get involved. And our first question tonight comes from Syed Hassan.
Thanks, Virginia. I migrated to Australia 20 years ago and made this beautiful country home. The part of the world I grew up, terms such as load shedding, blackouts were part of day-to-day life. Years after years, every government would blame the previous government of mismanagement, incompetence, lack of leadership. To be honest, the energy crisis we're having now seems like deja vu. My question to the honorable panel is, despite being a country full of natural resources, why are we still in this crisis? How real these threats are and how are we going to get out of this?
So why are we here? Saul, we'll start with you.
They say the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. And so it is with an energy crisis. The only real time to solve an energy crisis was a decade ago or 20 years ago. And so it is, in fact, possible to blame previous governments for where we are because we haven't invested in the grid resources we need. We haven't had a sufficient focus on what they call the demand side of energy. So we've focused a lot on making enough electricity, but we haven't been thinking about also changing out our gas systems in our houses, electrifying our vehicles. We're still short of a good electric vehicle policy in Australia. So we're paying for lack of planning over the last few decades right now. And I'm very sympathetic to the challenge of the minister who's on the line. He's inheriting that problem. And I'm concerned that Australia is going to see people try to monopolise and capitalise on this moment to make cynical short-term decisions, when really now is the moment we have to plan one decade ahead so that we're not revisiting this problem only much more frequently 10 years from now.
We're going to hear from all the panel on this. So I'll go to you first after that, though, Minister Bowen.
Well, thanks, Syed, and I certainly understand your question. And look, there's a lot of things that are responsible for this situation we're in, this challenge, this crisis. And there's plenty I don't blame the previous government for. I don't blame them for flooding in coal mines. I don't blame them for unexpected outages in coal-fired power stations. I don't blame them for the geopolitical situation caused by the war in Ukraine. What I do hold them responsible for is a decade of a lack of investment, a lack of transmission, a lack of storage, a lack of renewable energy, which is really why we're in this crisis. As I said, there's many things that have been leading to this crisis. The main one is coal-fired power station outages, most of which have been unexpected because the fleet is ageing. Now, that is inevitable. What wasn't inevitable is that we haven't had the investment in renewable energy, the investment in transmission and the investment in storage of that renewable energy, so we're storing it for when we need it, over the last decade. We need to build 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines. We need to increase our storage by 9 times. We've got a massive task and we're starting now. And that's the challenge, in that we've got some short-term challenges which we're dealing with, and we've been actually able to avoid blackouts and load shedding up until now, and everybody's working very hard to avoid that. Me, the regulators, the operator, the state and territory ministers, all working very hard to avoid that. But we've got a medium and longer term challenge and we need to get on with it. And that's what we're doing. Today we signed our commitment to 43% emissions reduction, and an important part of that is transitioning to renewables, electric vehicles, the whole shebang. We've wasted 10 years. We don't have a minute to waste now.
Zoe Daniel, you were propelled into Parliament, at least on part or in a large part, because of frustration like Syed. So how would you answer his question of how we got here?
Yeah, thank you, Syed. I think what's been happening is that the left hand has been deliberately not talking to the right hand for a long time. And that also goes to federal government not interacting effectively with state governments. So you've had state governments ramping down fossil fuels, and you've had federal government not genuinely participating in the process to renewables, or in fact, in many cases, actively roadblocking that. And therefore, we're in the situation that we are in, where we're stuck in the middle because of both local and international factors. But I actually think that this is a huge opportunity. Never waste a good crisis. We have structural problems in the system. We have a new government. We have people like me who've been elected on the back of an electorate that wants to end the climate wars. So let's fix those flaws and move forward.
Sarah McNamara?
Well, I'd like to speak a little bit in defence of our national electricity grid, because it's actually served us really well since state and federal governments along the eastern seaboard came together in 1998 and decided they were going to combine their resources in order to reap the benefits for consumers of the economic efficiencies of a national grid. Now, that's worked really well, mostly, for most of the time. Most of us can't remember large-scale blackouts, and I'd point out we haven't had any blackouts through this crisis. But what we're trying to do at the moment in Australia is transform our grid into a lower emissions future through to net zero by 2050, and that's a really exciting goal. But the grid is the biggest piece of machinery in this country. It's incredibly technical, it's very fragile, and we are going to experience challenges along the way. And of course, with any crisis, it's not just one factor that caused the crisis that we're experiencing at the moment. It's a coincidence of several things, a perfect storm. If we didn't have the kind of global pressures on coal and gas markets that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has produced, we'd be under less pressure domestically. And as the Minister mentioned, we've had some unplanned coal outages, which have been really unfortunate. They've coincided with some schedule outages as well. And unfortunately, seasonally speaking, we haven't been able to rely as much on wind and solar at the moment to help prop up our need for supply. Now, there is sufficient supply in the grid, but unfortunately, the challenge we have at the moment isn't easily resolved by more renewables generation, because we don't have a way to store that renewable generation in a long duration way to help us ease out those times when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining.
There's a lot to get to that we're already touching on, and all the questions will take us there. But Tony Wood, before we move to our next question.
The way I think about this is that we are children of our history. And our history is that we're a very large country with a relatively small population, a huge energy resource. We have just about every energy source you can think of. And Zaid, you mentioned this.
That's what makes it so bewildering.
Well, that's exactly. But interesting, what happens is when you have that, you actually squander it. And what we've been advantaged by is the way Sarah described we've been able to use the resources we've had and build an unusually strong economy in a part of the world which is very remote from most of the rest of the world. But as we've done that, we've built on that, and we've become a major energy exporter as well, we've not been paying attention to what the consequences are. And now we've got to change, and that's hard to do. And we know where we're going to go. It's been agreed by both sides of politics. The Labor Party has been elected on that platform. Many people have voted for people like Zoe on that basis. And so that potential is there. But coming from where we are, we've got to change what we do. It isn't just the coal generators we have to change. We're going to have to change. I live in Melbourne. We're going to have to stop using gas in our homes and so forth, right? This will not be easy, but the future is so clear. Getting there is not going to be as easy as we sometimes would like to think, but we can grasp it.
Syed, I just want to come back to you quickly before we move on. I don't know if that answers your question, but what are you most concerned about?
Look, I'm the sole breadwinner of my family, and I'm concerned by the rapidly increasing cost of living. The fuel prices are going up, the interest rates have started to go up as well, and now we have the energy crisis in our hand. So it does concern me in a way that, where this leads us. And did we not see this coming? Did we not plan well in advance? And that's what sort of I would like to know. We are at that point, but what are we going to do to get out of this?
Said raises a good point there about did we not see this coming? And I want to go back to you, Saul, about this. And we've heard from a number of members, including the Minister and Sarah as well on the panel, that, you know, so many of those outages that we have at our traditional power plants are unplanned. But at the same time, they weren't really. I mean, you don't maintain your power station as regularly as you should if you know that it's winding down to the end of its time, if that actually is being removed from the market. We saw so many signs of this problem coming down the track, didn't we?
I mean, most people who studied in detail could see this coming, precisely for what you mentioned. Our coal fleet, even before this crisis, has typically only 70 or 80% been running for the last few years. So it's not nearly as reliable. We're under-investing in it. It's sort of sensible decision to underinvest if you're one of those power
You don't throw
producers.
away, you know, good money if the whole system's shutting down.
We just failed to invest enough on the other side of the equation. And my concern right now is really to tie it to the other part of your question about cost of living. Average Australian household last year, $5,000 a year would be the cost of all of their petrol and diesel, the cost of their electricity, the cost of their gas. That'll go up to about $7,000 this year, and that's extremely meaningful, especially with the other inflationary pressures. And I'm concerned that we're not going to take the opportunity of this energy crisis to invest in the Australian household, because what is coming in this future that we can all see is that we're going to have a lot more solar on rooftops, because that's the cheapest form of electricity that exists today and will in the future. We're going to put electric vehicles in all the driveways. We're going to electrify the heating systems, even the cooking systems in all the homes. And we now need to start to think about 10 million Australian households as infrastructure, because they're going to be where the majority of the storage is, because 20 million electric vehicles is going to dwarf the size of the Snowy Hydro project. And so the opportunity right now is in addressing this energy crisis and thinking about future energy crisis is to get a 2-for-1 and invest in the Australian household as though it was energy infrastructure, which it will be. And then by doing that, you can now model out that we're going to be saving the Australian household $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 a year by 2030 if we have a wholesale commitment to electrification and we prioritise the household and put their voice in the conversation as we negotiate the new rules of the grid, which obviously we now need to renegotiate.
We have a question coming up about the requirement of the household in a moment, so we'll get to that. But I just want to get a sense from the room, if I can, a show of hands and vocal acclamation, if you like. If there's some sort of incentive or financial help for you to make that electrification switch, and here in Melbourne, in Victoria, as has been mentioned, we're very reliant on gas. Are you prepared? Are you happy? Do you want to make that switch? You need money or financial help to make that switch, some support in terms of the heat pump that you might need to use to fix up your heating and to change your cooking. That's what we're looking for. Well, that's the real challenge. And I know you'll get to that about, you know, who do you incentivise, who do you actually subsidise, and who do you not. But let's go to our next question. It comes from Linus Mays.
The national electricity market was designed for a fossil fuel-dominated network. Despite increasing amount of cheap renewables into the grid, Australian households and businesses are faced with spiking electricity prices. Is our current electricity market fit for purpose in a high renewable penetration world? Is it appropriately incentivising investment in renewable energy and storage, or do we need an overhaul of the electricity market?
It's a great question, Sarah. I'll come to you first, but I just want to acknowledge we have 2 energy clubs in the room tonight. And that's the kind of energy we bring at Q&A. You've got university energy clubs, and I'm reassured it's not just an excuse for drinking beer. They actually sit around and talk about energy, hence the great question. Sarah.
Thank you. Look, in Australia, we are at the forefront of investment in renewable generation. We are the world leaders in investment in solar PV. More than 3 million Australian homes now have solar PV on their roofs. We are, almost world leading in investment in wind as well. And we've got plenty of pumped hydro and other sources of renewable energy coming online. So there's plenty of investment and support for that investment, and that's all really positive. But what we need to do is work on transforming our grid with transmission investment to support those renewable technologies coming online, and also to acknowledge that we've got a lot more distributed energy resources as well now, with people in their homes. When you've got solar PV on your roof, you essentially are becoming a generator into the grid as well. And that's a huge challenge, and it's a big reform of this big complex machine that is our grid.
Sure, but how is the situation that we've got right now not an example of market failure after all the assurances that there would always be enough power when local consumers needed it and that natural competition would keep prices down? Now, for example, that New South Wales residents are told, don't run your dishwasher of an evening, that's what we've got to. How is this not a failure of the system?
It's definitely a system under a lot of stress at the moment, but there are no wide-scale blackouts. And the New South Wales Minister and the market operator has only suggested that residents in New South Wales run non-essential machines. That's basically...
Sure, just to return you to my interjection, which was about when we're always assured that we would always have enough energy in the system for retail supply. To actually get to that point, it seems like an example of some kind of failure.
It is an example of a supply crisis that we have in our wholesale market at the moment. It is a short-term crisis and it should be resolved in the coming days or weeks.
I want to bring in someone in just a moment who's had a lived experience of this today and has made a very serious decision because of it. But Chris Bowen, can I take you to the original question about, is the system fit for purpose?
Thanks, Linus. In effect, no. There's a lot of things that have to change. We need a massive upgrade in our transmission grid. We've got a $20 billion fund to do so. As I said before, we've got a big job to build the transmission to get the renewable energy from where it's generated to where it's consumed and efficiently, because somewhere on the national energy market, usually the sun is shining strongly and the wind is blowing, and we need to move it around much more quickly and effectively than the system is designed to do. We've got a big job to do. And one of the good things, I think it was Zoe before mentioned federal and state governments not working well together, and I think that is true historically. But last week we had an energy ministers meeting and we did come together very, very well. I chaired it. We had Labor, Liberal and Greens. We have a Green Energy Minister in Australia representing the ACT, and we all agreed unanimously on what needs to be done. We need one integrated plan. I put that to state and territory ministers and they agreed unanimously, and I'm very grateful that they did. We've got a thing called the ISP, that the energy clubs would be aware of, the Integrated Systems Plan, which is a roadmap for transmission. It was the maps of where the transmission wires need to go. We need that across the entire system. We need it about hydrogen. We need it about all the investments we need for the transmission. And we're going to do that. That's what the state and territory ministers agreed with me to do, to build that plan right across the country, integrated state and federal. So there's a lot of work to do and we're getting on with it.
So I know you want to jump in here, but let me just bring in Brett Lawrence. He's General Manager of South Australian manufacturer Intercast and Forge. Brett, thanks for joining us this evening, because I know that you've had a pretty tricky day. You're reliant on wholesale electricity. You've labelled the national electricity market a failure today. You've had to shut down operations and stand down 170 employees due to unaffordable operating costs. What's happened?
Well, the statement that the system is under stress is an understatement, to say the least, in our opinion. For the AEMO to effectively say there is no price puts us, when we're buying wholesale, in a position where we do not know the price and arguably have to decide that the worst case scenario, which is something in the order of $15,000 a megawatt, compared to about $60 a megawatt, is substantially likely to put us out of business if we ran. So 170 families that rely on us, we have to say, sorry, don't come in until we know what the price will be, with some surety.
When will that be, Brett? How long is this going to stay in place?
Well, the market operator has said it will be decided when it's decided. So what we've heard from other individuals, not from AEMO itself, is that will take a number of days. So arguably exactly what was said earlier, which is there's not enough supply, is exactly right. The transition from to a greener future has been botched, in our opinion.
Brett, do you have a question for the panel?
Well, yeah, the issue is in this transition period, we know, as was mentioned earlier, that this time of year there is far less consistent wind across the market. There is far lower solar inputs. We've already mentioned that there's not enough batteries. So in that transition, you are going to rely on gas and coal, yet we've enabled our country's competitive advantage to be exported away from consumers and businesses who part of the reason why the market has failed is because the cost for inputs to those generators is exorbitant, and they can't actually generate at the cap price that was set earlier in the week. So why are we giving away our competitive advantage? And that's on behalf of not just Intercast, but on all foundries, which is a large energy user in Australia.
Thanks for being with us this evening and for that question, and we wish you and everyone at your place all the best. Tony, I'll go to you first on that. Why are we selling away our competitive advantage?
Well, there's two issues I think that has been raised in that question. One is that many industrial companies of the size that we've just heard about have decided, for good commercial reasons, to take the wholesale market risk. They don't need to do that, but they've decided that's what they're going to do. They could have dealt, I expect, with a retailer. They probably didn't like the price that the retailer was offering them, so they took wholesale market risk. Now, that's a bit like, and I'm not criticising the decision they made.
I'm going to say, this is sounding rather like it's Brett's fault.
You just got to be careful that in doing so, you end up having to deal with the consequence. No one would have told, anyone would have expected...
Well, they wouldn't have expected that the spot price would have been suspended. That's what I want to get to. So you've got that situation, right? Yeah. Now, what's happened, I think, in some ways, is we've had, as Sarah said, a very strong transition towards renewable energy in this country. We are doing, in that sense, reasonably well. And just as we've got through the easier part of this process, that is, we've connected renewables on rooftops and most of the grid where we could do it. And as the Minister said, we're now going to start building out the grid for the next bit. And just as we're starting to think about doing that, and we're trying to take on board some decisions that would have been delayed since the blackout in South Australia, which was now almost 6 years ago, and we haven't adopted the things that were recommended then. Just as we're getting ready to do that, and the Minister's come in to try and adopt those things, we have the thing that Sarah talked about. And you put those together and you say, whoa, how do you create such a mess? And you have to try really hard. I know that Saul's itching to get in. Zoe?
Look, Virginia, it resonates with me a lot because of the small business people that I spoke to in my electorate today. And it's a slightly different situation, but what's missing for people in business is certainty. And you've got to rewind a bit, I think, to say we've come through 2.5 years of a pandemic. We've come into an environment of war, an energy crisis, flat wages, high inflation, people not being able to afford heating and their price of inputs escalating out of control. The small businesses that I spoke to today, restaurateur saying the cost of saganaki at his Greek restaurant was $140 a wheel. It's now $280. He's been warned by the supplier it'll be $340 next month. Oil from $34 to $96. So that's the cost of inputs. And then you put on top of that the energy factor. Now, another small business said, OK, the minimum wage has gone up this week. That's set, we know. We've signed a contract for butter. That price has gone up, but we've signed a contract and we know what that price will be. But the energy price we can't pin down because it's fluctuating. So those people, as well as wondering why we're exporting our gas offshore and not getting enough back from it, are saying we need some price setting so that we have certainty and we can plan for our businesses.
Saul?
There's a lot to say here, but let's start with this emergency we saw coming. So a lot of the work I do is also in the US, helping the White House.
You're actually advising Joe Biden on electrifying or getting solar panels, I think, on roofs. Is that right?
Yeah, so let's talk about some of that. So, even before the war in Ukraine started, the White House was pretty convinced that it was going to happen, and you saw that in the news release. We understood that all of Western Europe runs on Russian natural gas. 3% of the energy that the US uses is natural gas in the form of Legos and Audis being imported from Europe. And so we launched a regulatory effort in the US because extraordinary times, because of a war. And last week, President Biden deployed the Defence Production Act. The last time that was really used seriously was World War II. The Defence Production Act is designed so that the government can get in there with industry and release industry at full speed to solve an emergency problem. Yeah. And they're doing that to make batteries faster, to make heat pumps faster, even to make more natural gas and reserves of natural gas for the US and for Europe to get through the upcoming winter, because it's bad right now, but it's summer in Europe right now, and they will have a far worse problem than we're having here this Christmas. So we could have been planning for this 3 or 4 months ago in Australia and already have had some policy responses, but we didn't plan ahead. And then to tie it to the previous question, the NEM is then the rules. You know, we're trying to iterate the rules at the rate of 800 pages of proposed rule changes a week to the NEM, trying to take a system that was designed for a few dozens of generators, where we know that we're going to have 10+ million generators, far more distributed. We're going to have 30 million batteries on wheels. You know, we need to wholesale and much, much faster than the iterative process that we're running, address the rules and put the right motivations and incentives in place. And then just to hit on the last thing.
Just quickly.
Fossil fuels are by definition price volatility. This has been true since the Arab oil embargo in the 1970s. And you can look at the historical traces of these things and they look like this. Renewables have the predictability of a mortgage repayment. You've paid for the thing up front and you're just paying the interest rate. And so if you bought solar and a battery today, you're going to pay the same price for that energy for the 20 years into the future that they're living. So we shouldn't be that surprised about this energy volatility. We shouldn't be that surprised that it comes from international events and some local climate failures. And we now know the answer. And so we need to level up, get much faster to a new set of rules and a new set of incentives so that we're making our energy much more abundant and much more predictable.
Well, I want to get to our next question. I know everyone wants to jump in and have a say. I knew we'd never be able to shoehorn in all the issues in 1 hour, but our next question picks up where we are. It's a video and it comes from Vincent Gannon in Garay, Victoria.
We received a letter from Origin Energy last week informing us that the cost of our purchase rate electricity we receive from the grid will rise. At the same time, they have reduced our pay-in rate electricity we send into the grid. Why are we being punished for putting solar panels on our roofs and assisting with the power into the grid to relieve pressure on cost of supply? We would be better to go off grid.
Vincent, thanks for that question. Minister, I'm going to come straight to you. I hear this all the time on my radio program on ABC Radio Melbourne. What was the point of doing this? And of course, you get your power covered, but it was the strong encouragement was you could sell back into the grid and that feed-in tariff just keeps being reduced.
Yeah, I do understand Vincent's concerns, and obviously feed-in tariffs are a matter, you know, that are primarily decided by the companies involved. And
but we're talking tonight about, you know, general market failure, or maybe there needs to be some sort of intervention with what's set by the companies.
Well, there's been a big intervention in the last 24 hours, and I just want to deal very briefly with Brett as well, because I didn't get a chance to respond to him. I'm very sorry to hear what he's been through today, and I'm very happy to put him in contact, arrange that tomorrow with AEMO. But I must say what AEMO did yesterday was absolutely essential. My interest is for consumers. Consumers come first. And the action that AEMO took yesterday was the best way of ensuring that we keep reliable supply. So that was absolutely essential. But I'm happy to put him in contact with AEMO tomorrow. But in relation to Vincent's question, I think most of the panel would agree. I know Saul would agree that, look, making the transition to solar, and particularly solar with storage if possible, with a battery, which is very expensive for many people and not affordable, but where it can be done, and we have a community battery policy to help with that, which we'll be implementing, is better for the consumer, better for the grid, better for stability, particularly when accompanied by stability through storage. So I do understand that the solar feed-in tariff is going to move up and down. I'm not here to pretend that we're going to step in with any particular magical remedy or regulation of that, because we're not, because that system does need to develop and grow. But ultimately, we currently have 1 in 4 houses with solar panels on the roof. We're going to get much closer to 3 in 4 if we're successful, which I believe we will as a country over the next few years. And it's going to be very important. It's going to be very, very important, but it's going to require management, and particularly around storage and transmission, as I keep saying, because that is the piece of the jigsaw puzzle which is very much missing.
Sarah McNamara.
Thank you. So when you have solar panels on your roof, as I mentioned earlier, you essentially become a generating unit of energy yourself in your home. And when you're not home and that energy is being fed back into the grid, you're paid a feed-in tariff from your retailer. And the idea of that feed-in tariff, in order to be fair to consumers, you know, throughout the grid, is that feed-in tariff will represent the actual value of the electricity you're feeding back in. So when there's lots of electricity being fed back in, the price is cheaper. And during the middle of the day, when most people aren't home and the sun's shining, you are likely to get a lesser feed-in tariff than you might have at other times. And additionally, there's a lot of people with solar PV on their roofs now. So the feed-in tariff does move around. It is designed to represent the actual value of each kilowatt hour that you're feeding back into the grid. But I'd also like to touch on just an acknowledgement that the cost of energy is going up. And we know that not because of what's happening in the wholesale market at the moment, because your retailer almost always hedges against and shields you from the risk of the rises and falls of the wholesale market price. And that's very deliberate, so you don't have price shocks on your retail bill. But having said that, prior to this wholesale market crisis, we knew that prices were going up. They were coming off 8-year lows in December last year. And that's why the regulator, both in Victoria and elsewhere on the eastern seaboard, determined that for households, you're going to see upward price pressure on the regulated price of somewhere between 5 and 10% depending on where you live. And that's the regulated price. It's still a competitive market, and what's really important, particularly as we see this upward pressure generally, is that people make sure in their homes that they're on the best competitive market deal for their circumstances so they can put downward pressure on their energy bills. And having solar PV on your roof and getting a feed-in tariff should still be able to contribute to having cheaper energy bills.
Sarah, you mentioned a moment ago that, so far there's been no major outages or blackouts. How confident are you that we'll get through this winter period without any of those in our major cities?
Look, it's a tough winter, I think, and no one in any grid can give you a rolled gold guarantee that there won't be outages. But I rely on the advice of the market operator, and the industry is working cooperatively and closely with the market operator. And as we understand it, there is enough supply in the system. When the market operator stepped in yesterday to take control of the system, that was about being able to manage with greater clarity all of the moving parts that were occurring and understanding who had fuel ready to go and which units could be brought online. It's just an easier way to manage the grid with the market operator in control. It won't be forever. And with a bit of luck, we should be able to get through without any blackouts. We might need a little bit of load shedding at some point, but again, there's been no load shedding to date.
So. A little bit of load shedding, meaning a brownout somewhere.
Well, look, there has been some voluntary demand management requests of residential homes not to run your dishwasher or your clothes dry during peak times. In some ways, that's sensible advice anyway, because it's more expensive to run them at peak times. You're better off running them, on a timer.
Sure, but we're only talking about that because we're in a crisis.
Of course.
Tony Wood, I want to go to you on this as well, but also should people be right to feel a little disillusioned about the feed-in tariff they're getting for the solar power they're generating, or is that not really the point of putting it in place?
In some ways, this was a good idea that ran away with it. It ran away with us.
What do you mean?
Well, because we provided initially some very generous feed-in tariffs, mostly by state governments, but what they did is they basically initially, people who didn't have the solar were paying for the feed-in tariff to people who did. Yep. And that was a bit of an anomaly. We've got over that. As we've done that, the capacity for people to put solar on their roof has been fantastically positive. But the regulatory system, this is the perfect example of what Saul's talking about. The regulatory system, the rules by which all that gets connected, and the changes in the tariffs that the question was about and Sarah was responding to, have not kept up with the things that people are doing on the ground. And the same way as investors in large-scale renewable energy have been trying to build renewable energy projects in regional Australia, they've not been able to connect to the grid because it's not there, the point that the Minister was making. So they're great examples of a system that's just got to this point where we've made a lot of progress in Australia. Our electricity emissions have been coming down, our prices were coming down, and our system has been reliable. But now we really have to get on top of this and get all those systems in place, all the rules that Saul's talking about. We've got to crash through some of this. I think that's what the Minister's intending to do with his fellow ministers, is really get some momentum. And we need that to now build on what we've got. But we do have to get on top of this because we'll have more problems unless the rules and regulations get in front of the game, because otherwise what people are doing will cause more problems.
I want to get to our next question, and some of our questions now turn or focus on the solutions to the problem that we have. And our next question comes from Lily Gentile.
Hi, my question's for Saul. You say you believe that Australian households hold the key to transitioning to renewables, but why should Australians be expected to tackle the climate crisis that's been created by large corporations and aided by our government's lack of action?
So I don't think it should be the household's responsibility to solely solve the climate crisis. But for a very practical reason, I talk about households and small businesses as the near-term emission reductions that we can do. We can quibble about whether it's 40 or 43 or 50 or 60% reductions we need by 2030. It's a high number. Let's be really frank and honest. Green steel doesn't work yet and probably won't till next decade. Hydrogen at scale won't be done, if it's done at all, until next decade. So we're not going to eliminate any of these big industrial and other emissions until next decade. How do you get those emissions that you need right now? And it turns out that the technologies, they're a little bit expensive today, but solar was a little bit expensive 10 years ago and now is dirt cheap, are the things that are owned by the Australian household and by Australia's small businesses by virtue of being similar things. That's our vehicles, that's our hot water heaters, that's our space heaters, that's our rooftops for our solar and even our kitchens. So 42% of the emissions that occur in our domestic economy happen from that small set of machines that are in every Australian household. And here's the reality. In the next 10 or 20 years, 10 million households are going to replace all of those machines anyway.
So to get to the nub of the question, which is, hey, it's now our responsibility, is it? This takes us to a key point in your book, The Big Switch, about who do you incentivise, who do you subsidise, where does the money go? It's going to be about money, isn't it, in order to enable people to make that change?
Absolutely. This is the exchange of finance for fuels. So when you build a fossil fuel system, you have to keep on paying fuel prices, and that they have volatility. If you finance solar and the electric vehicle and the things, you have price stability, but you've got to make those payments. So it's that substitution. And very critically, it's why I sort of think about Australia's 10 million households as national infrastructure. It will be where the majority of our batteries live, by virtue of they'll be parked in our driveways. And we need to finance the Australian household with the same preferential financing that we give to infrastructure in Australia. And you should think about our cars and our homes in the same way and with the same priority that we think about Snowy 2.0.
Okay. Zoe Daniel, I feel like you're sort of our household representative this evening.
Well, thank you for the question. And I think my answer to why should we do it as households is because we can. And also because we're sick of waiting for our politicians to do it for us. So we have to force it. And I think that's what happened at the election to some degree, that community stood up and said, enough stuffing around. It's time to actually move this needle. And now we have a government that's in place, but sitting underneath that is a group of people that have voted to end the climate wars, to actually move this forward, to incentivise solar, to create an environment where people can actively action the things that Saul's talking about, to electrify their homes. And, you know, there's all sorts of pieces underneath that. The Minister talked about community energy. I've been working with one of the communities in Goldstein about a community energy project. But again, the interaction between the community battery and the grid has to be sorted out to make that a viable project. So that's a piece of that process.
That's a connectivity job.
Exactly, to make that feasible and profitable for the community, but to enable locally generated, stored and used energy to take the pressure off the grid. But I think the other thing is, you know, the elephant in the room, I feel, seems to be, why are we not getting a bigger return on our assets when it comes to our export of gas? And we talked about... Virginia, you said it's going to cost money, and of course it's going to cost money, and it's a complex exercise. Well, you know, there's this windfall profit happening, and the word tax is a dirty word, so let's call it a price equalisation levy. What about if you taxed the difference on what those companies were making before the war in Ukraine and what they're making now, and consider how much money that might mean to put solar on rooftops and create this electrification that we're talking about?
No, and there's precedent. Norway did this, right? Norway.
It's even worse than that, Virginia. It's even worse than that, because you go right back to when we started exporting our LNG, and we put in place a thing called the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax.
Yes.
We designed a tax that nobody pays. What a clever idea that was. Now, that's the problem. That is our gas, all of us Australians, and we sold this gas without getting the tax, the return, which Zoe's talking about, should have been coming to us. I mean, the gas users should benefit as well. The companies have obviously got to pay tax, but this idea that we've got the companies are not paying to use the rent on the resource that they're extracting at any like the appropriate rate, that should be fixed, in addition to what Zoe's talking about, when you've got companies making windfall profits. I think there's a challenge there because the first one, for the minister, is a much harder one to fix because resource rent taxes will be very problematic, and we know what the industry will say when he tries that.
Sure.
But the other one, I think, should be easier.
Well, let me go to the Minister. I still want to hear from Sarah on this because I think you argue that the companies are paying their fair share, even though the Australia Institute showed that at least 5 major companies paid, I think, 0 tax in the last few years.
Well, Virginia, my members aren't, are not as involved in the export market. And I do think one of the challenges, though, is it's very difficult for governments to retrospectively apply taxes and controls on resources that are already being exported overseas on long-term contracts. You've got to be very careful about sovereign risk issues. There may be opportunities to look at how we might better reserve gas domestically for prospective gas exploration, because gas is certainly going to be a very useful part of our energy market transition for some years to come.
Do you regret Chris Bowen not being part of a government that actually decided to reserve gas in Australia? And is there still an argument for us to step in and do something about that now? It still will be a key transition fuel for us.
Yeah, there certainly is an argument for making sure that we have enough gas in Australia from Australian gas production. Absolutely, I agree. And the question is the right tool to do that. And we've announced that we will look at reform there. There's a current thing called the trigger, but it's not really a trigger. It's not really designed for this purpose. It's certainly not of any use in this purpose. So we have announced that we will look at strengthening that and making that more effective. And you know, we've begun that process because at the moment the levers the government has at our disposal are pretty blunt, to be frank, and they need to be improved. And we have said that we will do that. We need to look at the problem and what the right solution is. It's very easy to say here's the problem, but you've got to design your solution very carefully. And a lot of ideas might be very worthy ideas, but they don't actually fix this problem. They don't actually change this problem before us. So that is a very legitimate debate. I mean, Sarah's right. We do have to worry about sovereign risk. We do have to respect existing contracts. I 100% agree with that. We're not going to start, going down that road. But
but you have pushed away the idea of a windfall tax.
Well, as I said, that's what we're looking at is the correct solution to the problem we're facing at the moment. And I don't think that actually would change the situation we're facing at the moment. What might change the situation is a more effective lever, a more effective trigger for us to be able to deploy when necessary, reluctantly and not lightly, but when necessary in the national interest, because the national interest should come first.
Well, I think the argument's about something that's actually ongoing and constantly, drawing something from our resource. Can I quickly hear from Tony Wood and from Saul on that? Tony?
Well, I would respectfully disagree on this windfall profit tax, because when companies are getting outrageous prices, making huge returns, which has nothing to do with what they've done as clever business people, they're getting returns above what they could have normally expected. That's the core issue, I think. Yep. Now, the Minister's correct. What you need to think of, how would you do something like this? The first thing I would do is to say, look, sell gas into this country at a fair price. Not what you used to sell it at when you had all your other gas on contracts. Not take advantage of the situation. Sell it at a fair price, or we're going to impose a tax on the profit you're making above a fair price. That would be, you could take it off when the problem's gone away. Yeah. And it seems to me it wouldn't be a sovereign risk either.
Saul?
I think that's a totally reasonable idea, but I think we're playing today's problem where we've got to be making today's problem solve the next few decades. And let's look at Norway. They were a very, very gas-rich nation. They made a sovereign wealth fund. They have announced that electric vehicles will be the only vehicles that you can buy in 2025. And by virtue of being a wealthy country from those natural gas windfalls, they are helping subsidise the population into that. Let's talk about that in the Australian context, because the energy conversation is always bigger and more complicated than you think. If we were helping Australians drive electric vehicles, it would be 2 cents a kilometre to drive instead of 20 cents a kilometre. Of the $5,000 a year that's hurting people in their energy expenditure, the vast majority for the Australian household is in the vehicles. So we should be implementing price mechanisms, like Tony just mentioned, in order to be subsidising the things that we would like to happen in the future and be using today to pay for it.
Just before I go to Ethan Miller, our next question, Mr Bowen, anything that you hear there that's terribly attractive to the government?
Well, as I said, you know, we're looking at what levers that will work for the situation we're facing.
Would those levers work?
Well, what would work is a reformed and revised gas trigger. That's what we think would work. I understand the arguments that are being put, but I don't think they're the right solution for this situation that we're facing at the moment. Now, let's be clear. I think there is a social licence on gas companies. We've been talking to the gas companies and asking them to put more gas into the system, and they have been. But at its core, I do have to say again, this crisis is primarily being led by coal-fired power station outages, not a shortage of gas in the short term, a shortage of coal-fired power. That's what's driving all the action that me and the regulators and the operator and the state and territory ministers are making at the moment. So we're dealing with these issues. But, you know, as I said right at the beginning, we've got to have the medium-term and long-term plans as well at the same time. And that's that national integration, that national plan that I've talked about, including hydrogen and the big conversion that we need to get underway.
Let's go to our next question. It comes from Ethan Miller.
Thanks, Virginia. And from one of the energy clubs, no less.
Fantastic.
So I work in energy markets and as an energy market consultant, we've recently seen the effects firsthand of price gouging by LNG producers, and we're talking about windfall profit taxes. And that's flowed into, obviously, gas-fired generators coming online at crazy high prices. Minister Bowen, does your government, alongside the competition watchdog, the ACCC, see scope for a rule change which will limit extreme pricing?
Minister?
Well, it's not just about gas with respect. It's about all generation, and I think the consumer comes first. Therefore, I have said publicly and privately, so publicly in forums like this and privately to the regulators themselves, they have my full support for whatever is necessary. That includes the Australian Energy Regulator, who made the position very clear to generators today and in writing last week or earlier this week what their obligation is under the law, and she expects them to comply with that, and she will take action if they don't. And I don't care who they are, how big, how small, who owns them. If the regulator takes action against them, she will have my full support. We've given the regulator some more powers through the State and Territory Minister to get to the bottom of what's going on. That's already happened last week. So I guess the answer to your question in one sense is yes, and we've already done it. And secondly, whatever they need, they have our full support. AEMO has our full support for the action they took yesterday, a very big intervention, and the regulator has my personal support for any action she needs to take, regardless of who owns them, regardless how big or small.
Well, Sarah McNamara will have a view about that, I'm sure, but can I come to you first, Zoe?
Yeah, look, I have just a point, which is I think we're talking about two different things. One is a supply issue, and that's to do with levers and triggers, and the other is a revenue issue. And I feel like we're going to miss an opportunity to talk about this revenue issue and the tax revenue that we could gain in order to fulfil what we're trying to achieve in regard to a renewable transition. I mean, the previous government did a study on the existing tax regime for gas exports and found that they would rake in $89 billion between now and 2050 if they actually fixed the system of tax offsets that are being used by those companies. That's quite different to what the minister's talking about in regard to guaranteeing supply and prices for domestic consumers. Yeah. That's a revenue-raising tool that we need in an environment where we are to the back teeth in debt.
Sarah McNamara, do your members feel that some kind of permanent control is going to be a legacy of this moment?
I think our members feel that we all need to work together to reform the system in some useful way. What really strikes us, I think, is that the market rules were set up in 1998 with the best of intentions, anticipating that you might need to have price controls in the market to cope with a few days of a summer peak, for example, in an isolated jurisdiction. What we've got now in 2022 is a long-term winter energy drought because of global factors and because of some outages, as we've discussed earlier. That situation is completely unprecedented. So what would be useful is, and the industry is working cooperatively with the market operator and with the minister and his colleague ministers and with the regulator. But when we get a chance to take a breath once this crisis has passed, I think it would be useful to look back and see how we might usefully reform how the rules work to enable perhaps a little bit less confusion and concern in terms of how we're managing the market through supply challenges.
Okay, but a lot of this is sort of making me feel like I'm going a bit crazy here because isn't a large part of the problem that, and Saul, I'll turn to you for this, that we have the gas, we have the energy. It's just not being, the amount that we need here is not being reserved for our use. I mean, isn't that a fundamental part of this problem, that we're not really sort of calling out the elephant in the room here?
We have all of the fuels. The problem is that when you rely on large centralised generators, whether that's coal or whether that's gas generators, there's only a finite number of them. And when you hit an emergency like we have right now, born of the global effects, we can't get enough gas to enough gas generators to substitute for what happened with the coal generators right now. So the problem isn't a fuel...
Hence the need for reservation.
It's the need for reservation, but actually really it speaks to we still have a mindset in Australia which I don't quite understand, which is around energy, which is not about abundance. We have absolute abundance. We should have not been putting in more generators of renewable or gas kind for the last decade so that we had an abundance for these types of moments. We certainly should be planning for the future where we're not planning 100% renewable, but so much oversupply that even these wind and solar droughts don't matter, because that'll actually be one of the cheapest mechanisms. Abundance is one of the cheapest mechanisms to deal with these failures.
And just before we move on, I wanted to just get your sense, Saul, given that this is a big part of your life and what you're working on. What do you think of the government's rewiring plan? Is it the right one?
It's difficult to say. Chris should tell us it was the right one.
He's not in the room, so you can probably get away with saying really rude things.
That's a good point. So my concern is that we are not thinking about what's inevitable. So we will need 300% of the electricity that we are currently using delivered to households and small businesses when we electrify all the things on the end use. And we'll need 5, 6, 7, 800% if we wish to become the renewable superpower that Australia can be. And it's unclear to me that we are really planning for that level of abundance. It still feels like we're playing defence around just decarbonising the existing grid, not truly having an integrated plan across all sectors, because transportation is now will be the electricity sector, building heat will be the electricity sector, and we need to be more audacious in that plan.
Is it a beginning?
It's a beginning, and absolutely we need transmission from our regions. Unleashing the renewable energy zones through a transmission plan is a great way to get the ball rolling.
But let me come to Tony, because Tony, my question for you is, if you wanted to get started on this tomorrow, I guess you could, but do we have the materials and do we have the labour?
Well, the answer to that question is right now is no. This will be one of Australia's great rebuilding projects to do what Saul's talking about, to do what Minister Bowen knows has to be done. And this is bigger than building the Snowy Hydro after the war and mobilising the labour, mobilising the materials. Any simple numbers will tell you this is an enormous challenge and an incredible opportunity. The jobs, the activity that's going to take place is going to be staggering.
The training that goes with it as well.
And I think we're on the cusp of doing it. That's why this right now, it's to some extent, as Zoe said, take advantage of this crisis to create the focus that then Minister Bowen and his colleagues at the state level will pick up and take forward and get the community support to do it this time. That's where I'm optimistic. And I think that, I think that what we're seeing, so far from the new government is exactly in the right direction on this particular topic. I think a reservation policy, by the way, is not the policy we need for this particular application, because even if we had reserved gas for domestic purposes, it would have been contracted to domestic consumers.
I'll tell that
what we read right now is, where do you find a whole lot of gas to fill a whole lot of gas-fired power stations right now? And the answer is not very many places, and you can't get it there. So let's not kid ourselves that an old-style reservation policy would fix it. The sort of stuff the Minister's talking about, I think, would be far more effective.
I don't think WA would agree with you on that, but anyway. Our next question comes from Mohammed Mossayed Ullah.
Thank you. Given that Labour Party has got the majority in the Parliament House, an independent member like Zoe Daniel How can she play a role in this current crisis energy market?
I think I'll come to you last, Zoe, on that one. Chris Bowen, you've got the numbers in the lower house. You don't need to Duchess Zoe Daniel anymore, do you?
Look, yeah, we do have a majority in the House of Representatives, no question. But look, after the election, I've spoken to Zoe a couple of times, I think, and I've spoken to all her colleagues on the so-called teal independents and welcomed them to the Parliament. I've made the point clear. Yes, we have a majority. Yes, we'll get on with our mandate. We'll implement our mandate. But if there are ideas we can work on together, then I'm all ears, and my door's open, my phone's on. I've made that point to Zoe. I've made that point to Zali Steggall, whom I met with the other day to talk through some issues of mutual interest. They've got their agenda. They've got their mandates from their seats. We've got our mandate from the country. But I think we need to at least try to put the climate wars behind us. We've spent 2 decades fighting about it. Where there's a good idea, which is complementary to our agenda, I'll be all ears and I'll work cooperatively with anybody, whether they be, indeed from the opposition, if there are any ideas, I will work with people.
I guess you'd expect a few cheap shots in the early weeks of the government. Zoe Daniel?
Look, thank you, Minister, and indeed I have spoken to the Minister a couple of times since the election. Thank you for the question. Look, I'm in the Parliament because I seek to collaborate. I seek to help create progress, and I was voted in by a community that wants progress and wasn't getting it from a stuck partisan two-party system. And I think a lot of people woke up the morning after the election thinking it was a new dawn of collaboration and cooperation on these sorts of issues. So it's not combative. It's a conversation. It's a contest of ideas, of wicked and tricky and difficult problems to solve that take our country forward. So, you know, as my old friend Cathy McGowan once said to me, an independent tries to work with the government of the day. I'm not here to be a blocker. I'm here to be a collaborator, someone who can facilitate progress, and that's what I'll work to do.
Let's go to our final question of the night. And it comes from Nicola Burgess.
Thank you. I think we all acknowledge that the weaponisation of the climate wars has been regrettable over some time now. However, looking forwards, and with any good plan, it's founded on actions, accountabilities and success measures. So my question is directed to Minister Bowen, and that is, casting your mind forwards in 3 years' time, coincidentally as we head towards the polls, what will success look like?
So in this field, Minister, what would success look like when we go to the polls?
Well, success will look like getting on with the job and bedding down our reforms, and people will be able to say they ended the climate wars and they got on with it. They got on with the job of building transmission, renewables. They were a responsible international citizen, and they created a lot of jobs as they did so, and a lot of investment, particularly in the regions. We've got to bring Australia with us. There's been too much division, inner cities versus regions, people saying climate change is an inner city obsession. It's an opportunity for the whole country. Yes, it's a challenge, but it's a massive opportunity for the entire country. A lot of jobs to be created as we build the green hydrogen, the transmission, the renewables, the lot. That's what success will look like. And in terms of accountability, I'll be reporting annually to Parliament on our progress and any problems we've had, any success we've had, and I look forward to putting that very openly and transparently before the Parliament as Climate Change Minister. It's the commitment we took the election. It'll be an opportunity to assess how we're doing as a country, how the government's doing, and for the Parliament to focus on the issue.
Let's hear from everyone on that. What will success look like, do you think, in 3 years, Sarah?
From an electricity industry perspective, we want to continue on our transition to a lower emissions future. We're committed to net zero by 2050, and actually the organisation I work for has an interim target in 2035 of a 55% reduction on emissions.
Do you reckon the government should take
We'd love to start the conversation, Virginia, and I'm hopeful we might have that opportunity sometime in the future. But also, you know, to date in Australia, the electricity industry has really done all of the heavy lifting on emissions reduction and climate change, reaching climate change targets. And what we want to do in the electricity industry is now start to help other sectors begin their transformational journey, sectors like agriculture and transport. And that's where the sorts of electrification projects that Saul's talking about could really come into play. And I believe that in 3 years' time, we should be have some really exciting progress in those discussions.
Tony Wood?
Grattan Institute, we like numbers. And the number we should see, and the chart we should see, and the chart Mr. Bowen should be able to present, is the chart that shows our emissions that were not heading towards net zero by 2050. That chart has bent down. The number that the government's put in place today is on a straight line to net zero by 2050. If by in 3 years' time we've got bent that curve so it's in that direction, that will be a major change from where we've been. I think, and it also means that we have to do not just the electricity, as Sarah said, but the other major policy, and we're not going to talk about that this evening, that the ministers are going to have to implement is the changes to the safeguard mechanism, which are going to bring down emissions in the industry, heavy industries, which are becoming the biggest source of emissions, and transport. So there's some big challenges there, but we can do it. There's the number, there's the target. The minister can judge his performance by that.
Sorry, Daniel?
In terms of performance, I think my measure is rebuilt trust, and that's to do with delivery and performance. As someone said to me this week, it's very hard to focus on integrity when you can't heat your house and you can't afford to buy a lettuce. So I just say to the minister, don't lose sight of why we're here and what we're trying to do. When you've been jettisoned into a crisis immediately after the election, it's easy to start getting stuck in that and forget what the big picture is, which is to rebuild trust and accountability and integrity for our communities.
Saul, 3 years' time?
I think the lesson from the election, as represented by Zoe, was this was not only the climate election, but this was very genuinely a community election. It was about households, it was about communities, it was about how they plan for the future. Irregardless of which party or if I was an independent, judging my success in 3 years, if I wanted, and I'm judging that success of if I want to win the next election in Australia, I think the project is measured by whether or not you can prove through demonstration communities, through implementing in real households, that we are going to lower that total cost of living for Australian households on their energy bills. And if you do that, you will absolutely win the next election. It will be an enormous success. Yes, we should also make the investments in heavy industry, but let's prove to Australia that we can lead the world by a mile on this transition. We can lower energy bills, improve quality of life, improve the air quality inside your home because the natural gas you're burning in your home is poisoning your children. We have everything to win. That is totally achievable in the 3-year cycle that we're talking about.
And that's all we have time for tonight, so please thank our panel: Saul Griffith, Sarah McNamara, Chris Bowen, Zoe Daniel and Tony Wood. Thank you all. A great conversation. Those energy comms, I tell you. Thank you for your questions, and to you at home for joining the conversation as well. Next week, David Spears joins you live from Werribee, one of Australia's fastest growing communities in Melbourne's outer west, and you can register to be in the audience on our website. And you can join me tomorrow morning on ABC Radio Melbourne. Until then, good night, go well.